So welcome. I want to talk to you about innovation today. I'm going to ask you some questions. So I worked, as we just said, I worked at a company. It had actually been family for 20 years, SRI. It's the place, a very famous place. It invented the computer mouse, Windows, hypertext, electronic teleconferencing, received the first internet transmission, but its business model had become obsolete. And it had been family for 20 years and was close to bankrupt when I took over. It had gone from 3,000 people down to 1,000 people. If we lost money, another 2 years, it would have gone away. Because when you're failing, you blame the other person. When you're growing, you celebrate together. When you're failing, you blame everybody. So we put in place the ideas I'm going to share with you today. Same people. When I left, we grew 3.5 times to 3,500 people, and we were systematically creating one multi-billion-dollar business after another. Intuitive Surgical, 100 billion. Nuance, 20 billion. HDTV, who knows? Satellite broadcasting of video. My teams won 2 Emmys for their work. And of course, Siri, which I'll tell you about, which was bought by Steve Jobs. So how many people here are value creators? Can you raise your hand? Are you a value creator? How many of you are not value creators? You're afraid to raise your hand, aren't you? Yeah, you should be afraid, because that's your job. Everyone here will be a value creator. Solving problems that matter to others is your job as professionals. Will all of you be professionals at some point? Some of you probably are professionals already, right? So your only really fundamental job, you'll do lots of things, but your number one job is to identify unmet needs of others, whether internal or external, and then address it. Does that make sense? Your fundamental job, what you're learning here at the university today and in Silicon Valley is your primary job is to identify and solve problems of others, okay? So how many professionals? So I've hired hundreds of PhDs from the best, from Harvard, MIT, Caltech, Stanford, IITs, ETH, you name it. How many of them came to SRI knowing how to create value for others? What percentage do you think it was? 100%? No. 80%? 60%? 40? 20? How about 0? How about 0? Not one. Not from Stanford, not from Berkeley, not from any school. They all had to be trained to know what it means, to identify unmet needs, and then create solutions. That was even true of a lot of the CEOs we hired. We had to basically put them through a program to help them get up to speed as well. It's basically not taught. One of my schools, Worcester Polytechnic, it's in Massachusetts, where I went to school. We're trying to make this part of the entire curriculum. So WPI is a STEM school, science and engineering, to be able to solve hard problems. It has projects. It's a project-based school. So all the students do not just one project, they do project after project. It pioneered that way back when. So they learn how to work with other people. All the students do a global project. So 63 centers around the world, and we go into the heart of China and India. We don't go to a bistro in Paris and drink coffee. That's not a project. That's not how you learn new cultures. Because we want you to do that too, because that's the world we're in. So the thing that's been missing is this ability to identify and solve problems for others. There is no school right now in the world that gives that skill to all of its graduates. So that's one of the projects I'm working on. We're not there, but that's our goal, to do that. So I'm going to tell you some of the things we're doing. So this is kind of our aspirational goal. We want the world to think about the students who come from WPI as being the best overall. I mean, they're always exceptional kids, right? But overall, the world's best value creators and innovators from WPI. So what's in this for you? So the people who have these skills are inevitably people who make an impact because they have the skills. Other people want to work with them. The best people want to work with them. And you can have a greater impact. And these skills are the one thing, if you learn, only become more valuable. All the technical stuff you learned, the business models of today, 20 years from now, the business models of today will be obsolete. And you'll have to figure them out, wave after wave. Just imagine what AI is going to do to business models. Unimaginable, right? We have no idea. But these skills, if you master them, are the ultimate professional skills that will distinguish you for the rest of your life. Okay? So that's my hope for you. So we've done workshops with leading companies. So imagine Volkswagen, Samsung, Lockheed Martin, GE, imagine Toyota, the BBC, imagine a who's who list of companies. And we go in and we do a workshop. What percentage of their most important initiatives that we do the workshop with, because we only work with the top ones, what percentage of those projects, when we're done after 2 days, do they decide have any value? You think it's 100%? No. 20? 0? 1 out of 6. It's typically less than 20%. Most of what they're working on has no value for anybody. That's been across the board. In one major automobile company, nothing they were working on had any value at the best time in the company, probably in 50 years. And these are all PhDs again from Stanford and Berkeley and Harvard and blah, blah, blah. So it wasn't the opportunity, it wasn't the IQ, it wasn't the training, it wasn't the facilities, it's they just didn't know how. It was very depressing, actually, because it's not taught. And I worked for RCA and GE in the first part of my career, and they did not teach me these skills. I ran a high-definition television program, and what would have been the first internet company in the world was Citicorp and NYNEX. The truth is, I didn't have a clue. I was dangerous to the company. I really was. I was spending tens of millions of dollars every year without a clue what to do. And then we became part of SRI, and we had to learn. So typically, we find it's less than 20%. Universities are worse. I'm sorry. I hope I don't insult anybody. By the way, they're always great people. So I always have to say, it's not a universal rule that you can't do great things in the university and in companies. People do all the time. But as a rule, you discover most people don't have these skills. 4,000 patents. How many of them do you think are actually innovations? How many? One? Well, that one's the big one. There's about a dozen that you can buy. All 4,000 of them are uniquely different.
Maybe they don't have a value?
They don't have value, yes. So nobody wants them because it doesn't solve a problem. And there's a name for that. They're called inventions. They're not innovations. Something novel reduced to practice. They're all new, but nobody wants them. And that's what we see most of the time. We make a distinction between two parts. There's value creation and innovation. So value creation is when you're working in your teams and you're trying to figure out what to do. So for example, for HDTV, for what I did, that was 15 years of research to figure that out. Now, I was doing a lot of other things, but it wasn't an innovation until we got to the end of it. But we had to put all these pieces together. So value creation is where you want to, it's a process of identifying and creating solutions to important problems that are unique and different from others and that satisfy your other stakeholders. So you have investors and you have your teams or what have you. Okay, so that's the process. And then it becomes an innovation when it's delivered into society so you can get it. And there's a business model or a sustainability model to keep it going. And when that goes away, the innovation may go away. So I have asked this question probably to at least 10,000 senior executives. How many have mentioned the importance of the business model? One. They know it, but they don't say it. They assume it. So how many times do you think I have seen presentations where they go, we'll get to the business model later? Is that a smart thing to do? Is that a smart thing to do? No. So you need to have both. You need to have something that people want and a way to make it sustainable. What's the definition of end user value?
I guess the value that the customer gets from the product.
Yes, for sure. So benefits and costs. It comes together. That's how you define value. So benefits over cost. And benefits or costs are only perceived by our end users. So what you think is really important, right? What you think is really important. But who determines the value of your new idea? The customer, right? Sometimes there's a series of people you have to satisfy. So sometimes there's a buyer, which is different from the end user. So you have to worry about both of those, right? Okay. So what you think ultimately doesn't matter. Isn't that terrible? I mean, it does. But if your customers don't love what you're doing, you have to start over. Now, I want to give you the definition of a value proposition, and I think you have to answer these 4 questions for everything you do in life. So I want you to be thinking about, let's say, buying a car. Let's make it simple, okay? So see if you have to answer all these questions. Okay. It has to address an important unmet need for you. So you're now the customer, okay? So do we have to identify your need to start?
Yeah.
Okay, we have to do that, right?
Yeah.
Say check. Check. There you go. Okay. So do we have to address your need in a new, compelling way? Give you something special? Do we want to give you something special? So that's going to be your approach. That's the car you're going to buy. And it's going to have hopefully something that's much better than is out there. And it will, of course, have benefits over costs, we just decided, right? And you're going to compare it to the competition. So when you buy a car, are there always alternatives? Well, what are 5 alternatives to a car?
Bicycle, scooter, motorcycle.
Okay. Okay, so lots of competition from not only automobile companies, but other alternatives, right? That's always true. Okay, so these 4 questions, what's the need? What's the approach for the offering and the business model? The benefits per cost and competition is what, when I went to SRI, everybody had to answer for everything they did. Because this applies to everything you do when you start to solve a problem for others. For others. What you do in your private life, I still think it applies, but it's a different thing. What happens if you take one of these questions away?
The value proposition is going to be not completely.
Okay, we'll take one away and see what happens.
Or we can take away the competition and build something that already exists.
Well, in principle, you could take it away, but is that a smart thing to do if you're doing? No. Okay, you could do it. What happens if the competition is changing while you're developing your innovation? What do you have to do?
You're behind.
You have to change, right? In fact, these 4 questions all interact with each other. So if the need changes, everything else might change. If you have new technology, the approach might change. So it's a little drill of answering these 4 questions. So we keep it short in the beginning because these are set the foundation for where you're going. So I have probably listened, I don't know, Oliver, how many of these have I listened to? Probably 100,000 at this point. From all the major universities you can think of, all the major companies you can think of. How many of them, of these professional teams, could answer those 4 questions when we start? It's like that. I was going to say 0. I mean, I can't remember one. They assume that you kind of get the answer. They forget the business model. They forget that there's competition. They don't share. There's a couple things that go on. I'm gonna mention them more. The first thing is people can usually identify problems, but then they jump to a solution, and it's almost always wrong. And then they fall in love with it, and they don't want to give it up. So that's the first problem. The second problem is they actually don't know the definition for a value proposition because it's never been taught to them. So they all have different definitions of what they're trying to do. So there's massive confusion in most organizations. And the third thing is there's typically no way for them to incubate the idea in a positive, supportive way that's efficient. Sure, there's often many different answers to these 4 questions for a given need. Yeah, that can happen. It's very rare that happens, though. Very rare. I want you to listen to this presentation. This is the best presentation I have ever seen in my life, okay? And when it's done, I would like you to repeat it for the team here. Can you do that? Can you pay attention to this and then tell us what's going on here? Okay, here we go.
For a number of years now, work has been proceeding in order to bring perfection to the crudely conceived idea of a transmission that would not only supply inverse reactive current for use in unilateral phase detractors, but would also be capable of automatically synchronizing cardinal grammars. Such an instrument is the turboencabulator. Now, basically, the only new principle involved is that instead of power being generated by the relative motion of conductors and fluxes, it is produced by the modial interaction of magnetoreluctance and capacitive directance. The original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing in such a way that the 2 spurting bearings were in a direct line with a panometric fan. The latter consisted simply of 6 hydrocoptic Marsal vanes, so fitted to the ambivation lunar wane shaft that side fumbling was effectively prevented. The main winding was of the normal Lotus O delta type placed in panendermic semi-boloid slots of the stator, every 7th conductor being connected by a non-reversible trimming pipe to the differential girdle spring on the up end of the grammys. The turboencabulator has now reached a high level of development, and it's being successfully used in the operation of Novertrunnions. Moreover, whenever a fluorescent score motion is required, it may also be employed in conjunction with a drawn reciprocation dingle arm to reduce sinusoidal repleneration. It's not cheap, but I'm sure the government will buy it.
What's wrong with this? Why is this a mistake?
So they're focusing on the features of their product
Yes.
solution and not the benefits that the customer.
Exactly right. Thank you. Perfect. What happens if you give a presentation like this to somebody you want to fund you? What happens to it?
They are going to be not engaged at all.
No. Yes. So what happens if they can't repeat your value proposition?
They don't understand your value proposition. That's why
If they don't, they will go away. They
There's
cannot
no value
discuss
proposition.
They can't. So if you give a presentation here in Silicon Valley, which I've done hundreds of times, you usually find a partner who likes you and gets to figure out what you're doing. But do they make the decision? No. They have to go sell it to somebody else. And what happens if they can't repeat your value proposition?
They would not join.
You're dead, right? Here's the biggest failure we see. People fall in love with their approach. This happens, this is 99% of the time, they look like what, from my point of view, they look like what we just saw. They're not that bad, but they basically are the same thing. People get an idea, they fall in love with it. We give that a name, we call that the big A. So Happens all the time. When you're giving your presentation, and I'm sure you've all been through this, you want to tell stories, sketches, whatever you can do, graphs, whatever you can do to basically communicate your story you want to do. And this is a little tip. A bad picture is often better than a good description. Sometimes just that picture took me 1 minute to draw. But it communicates the idea of someone on a device with a handle. It's got motors in the wheels, right? It communicates the idea, which would be better than anything I could describe to someone. The picture communicates the idea. One of the biggest mistakes we see is people say, our idea is better. Our idea is cheaper. Our idea is faster. So if you're in the computer chip business and you say you're 1% better, faster, nobody cares. You're faster, but nobody cares. It better be 10, 20, maybe even 100% if you want to get somebody's attention. And you need to tell them. If you don't tell them, how do they know? How can they judge what you're doing? What's the problem with that ketchup bottle? People want to fix that. So here's some solutions some students came up with. The solution was to turn the ketchup bottle upside down. So somebody had to invent a nozzle, a very special nozzle, very cheap. But when you turn the ketchup upside down, it sealed it completely. It's a liquid. And then when you squeeze, the ketchup comes out. So I don't know about you, but the first time I saw a ketchup bottle upside down, I went, oh, what's that? If somebody says they have a new innovation and you're not at least a little surprised, it probably doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You have to be surprised that they've seen something that nobody else has to make something happen. Stefan, when children come in to the MRI, little girls with brain tumors or terrible brain damage, and they see that ugly machine, and it scares them to death, and they start to cry. And what happens when they start to cry?
It makes the process more unbearable.
Nothing happens, right? So they were giving the kids sedatives, right? Now, if you have a 13-year-old girl with a brain tumor and you bring her into the hospital and they give you your daughter a sedative, are you happy? No. You're really unhappy, right? It's the last thing you want happen with your little daughter. So this is an example of the biggest mistake that I keep on saying people make. They jump from a problem to a solution. And what haven't they considered here? What's the big thing they've forgotten to do? Huh?
The satisfaction of the customer.
Yes, you have to solve their problem. You can solve the parent's problem if you solve the child's problem. So we just had an example of why most innovations fail. Okay, I want you to remember this example. If you focus on your need, as opposed to identifying the end user first, you will always be wrong.
Doesn't the sedative is a solution for a kid, but not for the parent?
Oh, so let's come to that. How many different stakeholders do you need to address in this example? The parents, we agreed the parents, right? Who else? The doctors, the nurses, the technicians, the hospital, all of them. You start with the end user, but you also have to identify all your other stakeholders and make sure you have a solution for them. This is a huge mistake. Please remember this. If you remember one thing from this talk, get a version of this chart and show it to all of your teams and do this with them. Don't jump from a problem to a solution. Find out first what is the need of the end user, in this case, the students. Yeah.
If we already know the problem, doesn't this mean that we know for whom it is the problem?
Almost never. People are good at identifying problems, but trying to figure out who really is the end user here and how do we address their specific need? This, by the way, so you know the answer. So it turned it into a rocket ship. So when they get into the rocket, when the noise happens, that's where the rocket is going to Mars. Entertainment didn't work. Toys didn't work. Nothing worked until they figured out it had to be that kind of engaging problem to be solved for the child. Okay? This is really hard stuff. And most people kind of skip over this, which is why most people fail. There are different kinds of value. There are commodities, offering services, experiences, emotions. Does this, who gets emotional value from this project?
Parents.
The parents, who else?
Children. Kids. Also the nurses.
Who else?
Are around. Children.
Who doesn't? Everybody does. Can you imagine being a nurse, watching these children cry? Or a doctor? Or even a hospital administrator? Would you be happy if children were coming into your hospital and crying? Everybody gets emotional value. So it's true, though, at the same time, the hospital makes money from this. Because if a child is screaming for an hour with a very expensive machine, with a very expensive team, that's a lot of money. So just this solution, which costs a few $1,000s, creates all kinds of value for the stakeholders. What was the big problem with those devices?
Some people could not read what's written on the button.
They had trouble pushing the buttons, little tiny buttons. How easy is it to search the internet on that device with those buttons? Was that easy or hard?
Hard.
It's impossible. Impossible. So, okay, so that's what people were complaining about. And the internet's going like crazy, so there are all these apps, and they can't get them. So not only is it a problem, it's a problem that's going to be huge. Okay, so it has to be fixed. Okay, who's got a solution? Maybe you know the answer to this. Who's got a solution to this? What did Nokia do first?
Maybe have like larger keyboards.
They did. They created good, perfect. So I'm going to come back. I'm going to ask you about this. Okay, so the input with the keys was slow and inconvenient. So we have to do that. So Nokia said, we'll solve the problem. Okay, this was your project in Nokia. Are you getting a promotion from this device?
Probably not, because people were not happy.
Probably not. Probably not. You're probably going to be fired after this. It has more keys, but it's a big, bulky phone. Who the heck would want this thing? Right? So this is someone with a brilliant idea. Oh, more keys. I'll make it bigger. Crazy. Doesn't solve the problem, makes it worse. Okay, so how many times have I seen this in my career? You think it's once or twice? I guarantee you'll see it endlessly. Endlessly. Okay, so we need a display where we can change the little buttons so we can find all those things on the internet. So we gotta somehow, that's the thing that's getting in the way. And so you as all know, Steve Jobs came up with a small computer with little reconfigurable buttons. But he also did something that was absolute genius. Because after he came up with the computer, the only way to interact with it at that time was with a stylus. Are you happy with a stylus? No. It gets lost. It's like pushing on the Nokia phone, right? So that was the next big issue that he had to address. And he did that with a touchscreen. Now, how many of you have seen Steve Jobs give the presentation?
I know.
Okay, great. You should all see that. It's the best presentation ever. And everything I'm going to tell you, you will see him do everything I have said in this talk. Everything. No exception. Everything. And he does it better than anybody's ever done it before and probably will ever do it again. And when he comes to this problem with the stylus, he said, we had to get rid of the stylus. He pulled it out and he showed that picture. And then he said, but we also have pinch. We can magnify the images. We have pinch. And the audience went, wow. They went, wow. Now, imagine you're now the senior executive at Nokia, and you're watching this presentation. And the thing he says after the audience goes, wow, is he says, we just patented this 1,000 different ways. So this is what happens if you actually think about what's the real need and how do we solve the problem. Okay, by the way, Musk is another one. Read everything you can by how Musk thinks about solving problems. It's not by accident that he goes from Tesla to SpaceX to space communication to, he's thinking very fundamentally about how do I change this market? Not by building a bigger phone with more keys, but doing exactly what Steve Jobs did. That's the way you want to think. Developing these ideas is not easy, so if you were in one of my workshops for real, what we'll have you do is work in teams on your projects. We'll ask you to fill out just the 4 NABC questions. You'll stand up. We'll give you 2 minutes to start, to present your value propositions. And then we'll go around the room, and we'll ask your colleagues to give you feedback. What was good? What can be improved? Eyes of the end user, eyes of the buyer, eyes of the stakeholders. We'll do that. And we'll take turns, one after the other. They'll all be terrible. They'll all be absolutely terrible, I guarantee you. And I it's not fair because I don't really know you folks, but since I've done this thousands of times, I predict they'll all be terrible. But you'll be watching your colleagues. You'll be figuring it out. And then we'll do it again. We'll do it again. And after 2 days, if we could do this together for 2 days, I guarantee you this, they will be the best presentations you have ever seen in your life. They may be, if you don't keep doing this, they may be the best presentation you'll ever see in your life. There's absolute magic in this, of getting feedback from your colleagues, because they get you out of this problem of who is the end user? What is a good solution? They're thinking about those things, and you're stuck. And this is what we did at SRI, why we could go from no money, failure for 20 years, 0 money, and still grow 3.5 times and systematically create one multi-billion-dollar company after another. It's not about the money. It's about the ideas you have and how you work together. When most teams get an idea, the first thing they want to do is build it. Build it and they will come. Another gigantic mistake. What you want to do is answer those 4 questions and then de-risk them, mitigate the risks. Little experiments. So when people would come to me and say, Curt, we need $1 million to build this prototype. I go, I'll give you $1,000. Go solve this problem. Prove to me we can do this. And then they come back and say, good, okay, okay, what's the next biggest problem? I'll give you another $1,000. Go do this one. So with almost no money, by coming up with big ideas, compelling value propositions, and by not wasting our money, by jumping from a problem to a solution and then trying to build it, what happens to those projects? They fail. So I want to give you one last example about Steve Jobs again. So people think, well, he did all this stuff and he was the lone genius to do this. That is completely wrong. He hired great teams and he was a risk mitigator. He wasn't a risk taker. He was a risk mitigator. They came up with the idea. They were looking at several alternatives. And it came to the point of the computer display, the keys were still too small. So if you have a keyboard. When you tried to find the key, you couldn't find the key you wanted. So it was making mistakes all over the place. So he gave, I think it was 4 or 5 teams. He said, I'll give you a week. If we can't solve this problem, this project gets canceled. But the first 4 teams proposed their ideas, and none of them worked. And then this guy came in, and he said, look, we got a computer. It's got a dictionary. When you type in some letters like BUF, the probability that the next F is almost 100%. So when we can predict that the next one's going to be an F, we can make that touch region bigger. We can make it bigger. And that solved the problem. He spent a week's time of one person mitigating the risk, and then he went ahead with the project. Okay, think like that, risk mitigation. Well, this team came to me with a buoy. You can see it's a buoy. And we built a material plastic where you squeeze it, it produces power. When this team came into me, they said, we want to build this thing, and I'm thinking salt water, mechanical device. Oh, this is a nightmare. There's so many things that can go wrong. So the team said, well, we want to build a prototype, a minimum viable product, a bad idea. I said, no, I'll give you $1,000. Prove, it's my standard thing. I'll give you $1,000. Prove to me we can do this. So one guy went off and he did this. He created this. That's the plastic material bouncing up and down. It's amazing how realistic it is, isn't it? Okay, am I feeling better at this point?
Yeah.
Why am I feeling better?
Because you have kind of visual something that
Yes.
you can see how it works.
Does it look complicated? Not at all, right? 2 tubes, all enclosed. So we took this to our customer and we said, this is what we think we're doing for you. Is this what you want? That's a big deal, right? He took it to his other investors. They said, that's exactly what we want. Meanwhile, in the week he was doing this, he wrote another 6 patent disclosures. So our patent position just went way up because he knew now what to patent. So he spent $1,000. I got the client to agree, the funders to agree, and we have more intellectual property. Am I feeling better? How much better am I feeling? Oh. Because what Oliver said, if we messed up on this, it could cost us millions of dollars. It would cost us millions of dollars. Okay, so here's another one of those little things. Do whatever you can to communicate your idea and take the risk out. This is a journey when you're doing this. When you start, how much do you know when you start?
I don't know.
Nothing? Did you say nothing?
No.
I love this man. He said nothing. Mazel tov. There you go. Nothing. Why is it nothing? I mean, you do know things, right? What's the problem? You also know a lot of things that aren't true. So you know some good things, some negative things. How much do you know? Nothing. Nothing. So you're on a journey and you've got to learn new things and you've got to get rid of all this baggage going forward. So at SRI, we had those meetings, but we all stood up. We got feedback. We were always going after things that were of significance. We never ended up where we thought. Never. But if we were going after big things like Siri, we almost always ended up in a good place. That was our secret. Most people don't do that. The last story is about Siri. So that was another decade of work. We're doing other things. We're commercializing other things. We're doing all kinds of other things. But we had our eye on this. So we eventually created a value proposition. We didn't build the thing, Remember, we were expense minimizers. We took the risk out of it, and finally we decided we could actually do it. High probability. And we formed the company, and that's the team in the center who did it. And a couple weeks after the product was launched, Steve Jobs called up our CEO, who's in the center. His name is Doug. Doug, hi, this is Steve Jobs. Doug says, no, you're not, and he hung up the phone. So he's one of the few people I know who actually hung up on Steve Jobs. Okay? He calls back, he says, no, this really is Steve Jobs. I want to talk to you guys. I want to take you guys out to dinner and talk about your company. So we didn't want to sell it, but the price kept on going up, and finally we said, okay, you can buy it. And we added $75 billion to Apple when we did that. This idea of the value proposition never stops. In passing, I want to mention is that this is not like 4 months ago. You can now learn this stuff so much faster. With AI, having the methodology we developed on Zoom, it's transforming how fast. Normally it takes us 8 value creation forums to get people to a good place. I'm now getting student teams to a really good place in just 3 iterations because they come in using the AI tools to know what a value proposition is, to have a first iteration. So every concept we teach now, we teach them first using an AI tool, I call them AI tutors, to learn the fundamental concept. Revolutionary. So I think for the first time in my life, I think we're going to be successful at WPI at giving every student who graduates all the things we talked about today and a lot more. I also am on Coursera. There's a free version of it. It's got a rating of 4.8 out of 5. Pretty good. And we obviously do workshops for folks.